Most horrible evening out there, or certainly had been during the day, all lovely and warm and dry here in the library tonight. So just a little bit of housekeeping. If you put your phones on silent please, and if you take note of the exits in the event of an emergency, up the steps you entered into and away to the left and through the door here to the right hand side, and run like Billy, break the world speed record, following on there, our leader. Now, as I said, you're all very welcome tonight. I'd ask you that if you have any questions, if you hold them on to the end. What I'll do, I'll introduce Cormac here. He's only a young fella. Give him a chance, give him his big break here tonight, okay?
This place was largely destroyed in the 1916 Rising, and a huge amount of their photographic collection was destroyed with it. And what remains is about 40,000 images on glass plates. Their carte de visite collection, which I will tell you about in a moment, was gone. But the main man who did all of the photography for them was this man here, Robert French, a gifted photographer because he had a great eye. But it was mostly scenes that he took, because an awful lot of the photographs would have been sent abroad, particularly to America, to emigrants who wanted to get a glimpse of the old country. So there are far more places than people in the likes of the Lawrence collection. Now, you also have these collections of photographs that were done by very rich people, like this lady here. Now, her collection is in the National Library. Lady Cormac, Augusta Dillon. She left a huge collection behind her, which are now in the library, but there's an awful lot of this sort of stuff in it. They photograph themselves and their own type of people. You don't see very many photographs in these private collections of carpenters hanging doors, or brickies laying bricks, or fellas plastering walls. You'll see an odd snapshot of a fella shoeing a horse maybe, but they're mostly of their own sort. That's it. But I'm not sure where this was, but these were actually stone breakers. And I think it may be from the Clonbrock collection, I don't know, but you don't really see many photographs of the peasantry as they were known. But I think this typifies the sort of ridiculous sort of clothing that the poorer people wore. Some say they were the hand-me-downs from the gentry from a previous generation. But it must have been the most impractical clothing to be wearing in building or agriculture. A frock coat with tails, knee breeches and a big tall hat. You'll frequently see illustrations of Irish fellows at fairs and all wearing that sort of clothing. The other sort of photographs, if you like to call them that, were called daguerreotypes. Now the problem with these were that you only got a one-off thing, whereas with a photograph you got a negative and you could repeat the thing several times, you could print off it many times. With a daguerreotype you only got one image. There was simultaneous development in photography in various places by various people, and these originated in France, where another branch of negative photography, chemical photography, originated. And that's why these are so rare. If you own that one today at the Duke of Wellington, now, it'll be worth quite a lot of money, and they're great collector's items, but you only got a one-off go of them, and they're very, very sharp and very clear, and they're printed on copper, or they're developed on copper rather. This was originally a daguerreotype of Daniel O'Connell, taken at the time he was in the Richmond Bridewell, when he was in jail in 1843. And what they used to do was, somebody would get the daguerreotype and take a lithograph from it. Now essentially that's just a drawing, although it's almost of photographic quality. But that then could be sold or passed around, whereas you couldn't do that with the daguerreotype. That's an etching of the Richmond Bridewell that O'Connell and several of his repeal movement friends were in. They had been tried for sedition and given fines and prison sentences, and they were in the Richmond Bridewell for considerable, well, for several months at any rate. But in actual fact, the Richmond Bridewell is essentially still there. It was converted into the Wellington Barracks, and it's essentially still just the same building. It's now became Griffith Barracks and then Griffith College. It was known back in the 19th century as the Cease to Do Evil, because over the portico there was a sign that says, "Cease to do evil, learn to do good," or "learn to do well." It's a biblical quotation. It was up around, you see illustrations of it. There's no actual photographs of the inscription. But recently, another set of daguerreotypes that were taken in the Richmond Bridewell became available. I think they're in the National Library, and they remained hidden for a long time. Now, unfortunately, the worst of them is this one of Daniel O'Connell, because it either seems to have just degenerated, or it was damaged. it's hard to say. But I think you can get a reasonable idea of what O'Connell looked like from that. It's a dreadful pity that it hasn't survived in better condition. He's wearing one of these. These were called Liberty caps or repeal caps, and a lot of the repeal movement people wore them. Green velvet with gold shamrocks on it, and that one's in the National Museum. That's Charles Gavin Duffy, the only photographic image of him who was in jail with O'Connell. And Matthew Ray, who was the secretary of the repeal movement. You can see his signature on a lot of repeal documents. And this man here, now I wrote an extensive paper about this man because he was an extremely interesting character called Thomas Steele. He was O'Connell's right-hand man. He was known as the head pacificator for Ireland, and it was a very important job that he had because the potential for violence during this time was enormous, and O'Connell could see that it was never going to get anywhere. They couldn't take the British on militarily. So it had to be done by political means. And Steele had the job of going around trying to pacify the country, persuading people not to get involved in violence of any sort. He was mad as a brush. He was known as Mad Steele. But what interested me in him and what got me onto him in the first place was that he was also an engineer and a man who designed diving equipment. And he dived with some of the early the helmet divers called the Deans, who invented the diving helmet here. And he dived with them off Portsmouth when they discovered the wreck of the Mary Rose in the 1830s. And they recovered certain artefacts which are still in the museum. There were more of these recovered in the 80s when the vessel was raised. These are guns from the Mary Rose. Also in jail with them was John Gray, who was the owner of the Freeman's Journal. He was in jail with O'Connell and the rest. But I think that's actually a photograph and not a daguerreotype from a later period. That's a statue of Sir John Gray. That's in O'Connell Street. A very fine sculptor it is as well. And I'll be showing you a photograph of the man who did that, Thomas Farrell, later on. You can get a picture, an idea of the tram lines there. We'll be seeing a good bit more of those in what was then Sackville Street. The man that brought the Varsity water to Dublin was responsible for bringing the water from Roundwood as far as Dublin for the citizens. Just speaking of jails, I just came across this. This is a photograph of the front of Newgate Jail. And that's the gallows that they used to hang people from in public. That bit there. You can actually see the trapdoors that fall down. And there were two Newgate jails, of course. One was up near High Street, and that was knocked down, and the one in question is the one that was over beside Green Street Courthouse, where the statue is today. I just thought I'd show you that because it's so bizarrely interesting. But another type of photography that was in existence, and they're probably the best images of Ireland in the 19th century that are actually around because they're extremely sharp, were these stereographs. There's a double lens on it and it took a double image. And when you looked at it through a stereographic viewer, you see things in 3 dimensions. I brought one with me tonight, there's one there. And I brought a few stereographic images, you can look at them later on. A few Dublin ones. But that was actually invented in the 1850s. And it was, as far as I know, it was invented in America. And it was a huge amount of stereographic images taken in the late 1850s and in the 1860s. And a lot of those were in existence, and they were taken for the very reason that I mentioned about the Lawrence collection. They were a commercial venture. There were sets of them sold in America, mostly to immigrants, because there was huge emigration from here after the famine, during the famine years and after the famine. And they were very, very popular in America. And you can buy, they're very collectible now, you can buy whole sets of them. That's the stereograph, you can have a look at. But this is the sort of image that they produced. Now I can actually look at those without the stereograph, and after a while you kind of go a bit cross-eyed and the image appears in 3D. But you can do the same with the tiles on the wall in the bathroom sometimes. But a lot of people can't do that. But the other type of photographs then that were available to the public were these cartovists. They were produced professionally. Now they were produced by the million, by the likes of the Lawrences and various other photographers that were around Dublin. And you generally didn't get people's names on them, except that you happened to be somebody notable, like this one of Oscar Wilde. It literally means just visiting card, and you can buy them by the dozen or by the 100, give them out to your friends or whatever. And all of the cartovists in the Lawrence collection were destroyed, but there's still a great many of them around, and nobody knows who the hell anybody is on them. You know, that's just one of my great-great-grandfather, who was an inspector in the DMP out in Blackrock, Thomas Lowth. He lived in Blackrock also. A very early photograph, just thought I'd show you, of Thomas Moore, the poet, taken in the early 1840s. I have another one of him, but I don't have it in this, with his family. He was a very small, diminutive little man. And there's a good friend of mine was a photographic historian, the late Eddie Chandler, who wrote a very fine book about photographic history in Ireland. And Eddie discovered this photograph of Thomas Davis, it and another one, the only known photographic images of Thomas Davis, who died in the 1840s. But photography came into the realm of the common man then with the invention of the box brownie. And my dear aunt kindly left me hers in her will. That's all she left me. And I have it at home. I meant to bring it with me tonight. But all you got from those were little snapshots, small little snapshots like this, and they weren't of very high quality. But nevertheless, it meant that you could now take your own photographs. But the man that's accredited with a lot of the photography as we know it today was this man here, William Henry Fox Talbot. Now, he wasn't just a photographer, he was a polymath, a great astronomer, and he was a mathematician, an engineer, and a whole lot of things. Now, he had relatives in Ireland. I think they were the Talbots of Malahide. And he reputedly took photographs here in the 1830s, and that's supposed to be the earliest one that he ever took in Ireland. And by definition, it's probably the earliest photograph took in Ireland of the quays. And you can see it's not very clear, but you can see the customs house there and some very, very old-fashioned looking sailing ships against the wall. There was even a bit of graffiti back in the 1830s on the wall here. Fellas sitting down along the wall there. But that's by far and away my own favourite photograph of Dublin, because I think it defines what Dublin is, Dublin as a port. Dublin as a city, I think, owes its existence to Dublin as a port from Viking times and before. Going right back, and like you couldn't get any nearer to the heart of the city than that, when the ships could come right up to the Carlisle Bridge, which is now O'Connell Bridge, and Sackville Street. And you can see here a forest of masts going away down the quay, and a fully laden brigantine coming in. Now all of those were probably mostly carrying coal, but by the same token they would have been carrying all of the other goods and chattels of everyday commerce. Somebody has described them as the juggernaut lorries of their day. But they say money makes the world go round, but what made the world go round in the 19th century was this stuff here, because you needed it for cooking, for heating and for lighting, because they got the gas for the gas lights from it as well. And a huge amount of the traffic, there was millions of tons of coal came into the country during the 19th century. This is a fine photograph. Now it's later than the Fox Talbot one, but it typifies the way coal was brought in. They actually used the rigging, they used the yards of the ships to trim them inboard over the quay wall, and they used the ship's rigging to haul the sacks of coal. It was probably bagged down in the hold and load them directly onto carts. But you can see something very interesting going on in this over on the left hand side there. The guy here having a kip on a pile of coal sacks. And there's a horse here with his nose in the nose bag there. There's quite a few photographs taken this angle. A street urchin in his bare feet with the arse out of his trousers. There's actually three ships here. There's a wooden schooner in the foreground, an iron vessel outside that, and another one on the far side of the quay there. But that will give you an idea, again, of the whole thing about coal. You could actually rent, if you were a shipper, you could rent a portion of the Campshire. This part of the quay wall is called the Campshire. And you could rent a portion of the Campshire, discharge the coal straight onto it, and it would be loaded, weighed out then into bags or onto carts for the carters to go around selling. And you can see that happening here. You have a cartload of sacks here, you have all kinds of stuff here like steel yards and weighing scales, and a shelter over there which was undoubtedly for the gotchi, the watchman, who would have to keep an eye on the coal at night time to stop people from robbing it. But you can see there that the swing bridge that we'll talk about now in a minute, Butt Bridge, has been built at that stage, and O'Connell Bridge is now in existence rather than the Carlisle Bridge. Just have a look at this building here, because I'll be talking about that later on, the one on the corner there beside the Corn Exchange. That has to do with O'Connell also. But now, even in my time, when I was a kid, this is the way they used to discharge the coal. Now they do it with big mechanical grabs. But it was nothing to walk down the quay, John Rogerson's quay, and you could look into the hold of ships and see fellas filling these big iron buckets full of coal when you were a kid, and then they'd be lifted up and tipped into a lurry like that. We're just pulling a catch, they'd be upended into a lurry. We just put that in there because I bet you there's nobody here ever did that. Scutting on a coal lurry. But I'll just move on. I mentioned O'Connell Bridge now, and we just concentrate on that for a minute, because as the century wore on and as traffic increased, the port got bigger and the berthage in the port was improved. A huge amount more traffic, which was horse traffic solely, and was found that the Carlisle Bridge was too narrow. It was a narrow humpback bridge, whereas O'Connell Street or Sackville Street was reputedly one of the widest streets in Europe. So it was decided to build a wider bridge, and a competition was launched for the design, with none of which were suitable. So this was the port engineer, a genius called Bindon Blood Stoney, who had been responsible for all the deep berthage that was built in the port on a prefabricated basis. He just went ahead and designed it himself. Just before that, it was felt the need was to open up the traffic of the city up towards the North Circular Road, and the swing bridge, which predates the present Butt Bridge, was built. Now, there was controversy over it when it was built, because it was to have been called the Beresford Bridge, but nationalist councillors in the city weren't having that, because Beresford was associated with the 1798 rebellion and the tortures that had taken place in his riding school over in Marlborough Street. So it wasn't deemed suitable to name a bridge after somebody like that, and they wanted the name Butt Bridge, which it became known as, but there was never any official naming of this bridge. It was always Butt Bridge to Dubliners, as the present one is. But it swung and it allowed ships to go up to the upper part there, towards the Carlisle Bridge. And that's a photograph of it being built. The only stop to present day HSE, there's a notice on it saying danger. But you can see there that the ships are still coming up there almost to that. And that's a photograph of the Butt Bridge on the day that it was opened. It was operated by steam, and I think the steam engine was somewhere over here in a hut, and it was able to swivel. Amazingly, there's not one woman in this picture. The guy's day out it was. But that's a very, very early photograph now of Sackville Street and the entry onto the Carlisle Bridge. And you can see there how wide the street is and how it's getting much narrower here as it approaches the bridge. And that's part of an earlier stereographic view of the same street there. You can see a good lot of traffic there moving on it. It always amazes me to look at the types and the amount and the variety of vehicles that there were around then. And a fella on horseback as well, very unusual to see that. But that's a photograph of the Carlisle Bridge as it was before it was knocked, before Bindon Blood Stoney replaced it with the present bridge. That's the ballast office there. That was the headquarters of the Dublin Port and Docks Board. And that item up there, you see the round ball here? That was the time ball. Now, that was dropped at 1 o'clock every day. It was raised up, and at precisely 1 o'clock it dropped to give mariners in the port a chance to check their chronometers. It was controlled from Dunsink Observatory by an electric clock. And I wrote a paper about the man who invented the clocks and who installed the time ball. I'll be mentioning him briefly just later on, I think. Or well, I know I won't. But his name was George Prescott. Amazing character. I'll give a talk about him some night. But the clocks are still to be seen in the Engineering Museum in Trinity. That's it looking at the Carlisle Bridge from the opposite direction. That'll be taken from up on top of Kelly's, the gunpowder office. And you can see the statue of William Smith O'Brien in the centre of the roadway there. That also contributed to the traffic jams that used to take place, the statue. But that's now on O'Connell Street. But this is a photograph of the bridge, O'Connell Bridge. It was renamed, it was named Carlisle Bridge when it was built, but it was very quickly afterwards renamed O'Connell Bridge in the process of being built. And you can see here that there's sewerage and water being diverted here. Ships still coming up. The work ongoing. Unfortunately, this haziness was in the thing, and I lent the originals of these to somebody and never got them back. So these are only photographs of scans that I had taken. Unfortunately, I never got them back. But the originals are very, very much sharper than this. Nevertheless, I think it gives you an idea of the sheer amount of work that was involved. These bits here, you can see that the bits without the cobbles, they were for just simply for pedestrians. And guys used to stand there with a brush, sweeping the dung off them, and you gave them a few pence. You often had the expression, "I'd sooner be sweeping the streets." But they promptly swept the dung back onto it, apparently, as soon as you were gone. You've often heard the old song that Ronnie Drew sings, "The Twang Man." He loved a lovely maiden as fair as any midge, and she kept a treacle billy depot one side of the Carlisle Bridge. Now, a treacle billy was a toffee apple, and I think it's highly probable that that lady there is selling toffee apples. And this could well be the Twang Man sharpening up his big toffee knife to take the life of the poor owl gathering them up. Very fanciful notion, but and that's it, ready to go. The only thing that has to be moved now is the statue. You can see there that the bridge is completed, but there's something going on there. Something going on, there's a big hoarding around here, and what that actually is the preparation of the site for the O'Connell Monument. It's a photograph taken on the day of the unveiling. It's either of the unveiling or of the laying of the first stone. I'm not sure, because there was no dates on an awful lot of these, and it's very, you have to try and work out for yourself when the date was. Foley, John Henry Foley, who designed the statue, he didn't finish it because he died before the thing was unveiled. And you can see there there's something missing from it. His assistant completed the project. You can see there that the angels or the winged victories, whatever, are not on it. They were put on afterwards. And there's a photograph of the bridge again, with the incomplete monument there. Looks very bare without them. Yeah. And horse trams, we're going to see plenty of those as we go along. Does anybody remember those? There's still a few of those knocking around in the 50s. And they weren't just tourist things, they were actual taxis that you would get down at places like Bussardus and what have you.
Yeah, you imagine.
Yeah. There's a horse tram over there. This is unusual because you have the pylons, or if you would like to call them, the poles are up and the wires are in place for the electric trams. Nevertheless, you still have a horse tram, and the statue has been moved. Oh, sorry, the statue is still in position. It hasn't been moved further down. But you can see here prodigious amounts of dung on the street. Just have a look at this area here when I switch over. The copper there has a fella in a horse and cart pulled up. I wonder what that was about. Was he speeding, I wonder? And there's some of this dung. The sheer amount of horse traffic that was on the street, there must have been an awful lot of it. And a man on a bike. But that's unusual because somebody on just an ordinary horse and cart carrying big long poles, whether they're metal or wood, we don't know, probably scaffolding poles and timber. That's the statue there. Beautiful statue of William Smith O'Brien. He was one of the, as you know, the young Irelanders who was transported. And he was eventually pardoned and let him home. But that's Thomas Farrell there, in his studio, executing the statue of Barry Sullivan, who was a famous Irish Shakespearean actor. Now you can see that one in Glasnevin, nearly opposite the O'Connell monument, the O'Connell tomb. And you can see I think that's the same thing, that they probably made a maquette out of plaster, first of all, and a copy of it. There are a few of Farrell working on statues. There's also a fantastic one by him in St. Patrick's Cathedral, if you're ever in there, the one of Captain Boyd, who was lost out in Kingstown in 1861 from the guard ship Ajax. Now that's the building I pointed at earlier on in the picture of the coal on the quayside. That's Conciliation Hall over on Burke Quay. Now that was finished in 1843, just before O'Connell and his friends were put in jail. They were put in jail for sedition, for inciting sedition among Her Majesty's subjects, and that could literally mean anything, because it was whatever they decided it was going to be. You know, if you raised your head above the parapet at all, you could be charged with sedition. And that's a photograph of it back, I'd say, from the late 1850s or early 60s, when it had ceased to function as such, and it had a few various functions after that. That's another nice photograph of it before it became the theatre. I don't know what it was used for after the repeal movement collapsed. It was used for a number of functions, but it subsequently became the Tivoli Theatre. And my father was a building contractor who had a joinery works, and I served my time with him as a carpenter and joiner. And one of the very first jobs I was given when I finished serving my time was to go down. It was then the Irish Press Office. The Irish Press took over after the Tivoli Theatre to take out the up and down windows, leave the frame, to just take out the sashes out of those 5 windows, bring them back up to our workshop and make new ones, and I put them in. More's the pity I didn't keep one of the old ones, because they were the original ones from O'Connell's time. But it was a very popular theatre, and it kept going as such as a theatre until 1928. That's a blow-up of the entrance there. Wait here for the early sixpenny pit. You can read it, you can actually read it. Give you an idea of the clarity of the photographs, that you can actually read the posters in them. Those were mostly variety acts. A photograph of Dame Street with a prodigious amount of horse traffic on it. And again, I often wonder what, they all served a different function. That's a fairly normal high one, but there was an awful lot of these low carts with a low underslung axle on them. And I think it was simply just for ease of loading. And you see all sorts on them. But there's a nice little pony and trap there, driven by a single lady. And a fella sitting in the top of a horse tram going along here. But that's just a close-up of that. Looking down towards, I'll just go back there and show you, because we're going to be looking at again, and you can see King Billy's statue down there in College Green in the distance. I'll show you another one of that now in a moment. But that there, that's a similar view on a day of one of the royal visits, of which there were a great many in the 19th century, when the King or the Queen or the Duke of this, that and the other, or the Prince and Princess came over, and the Dubs got out the flags. Now from this period we get a nickname that has stuck to all of us since then, because they used to give out little Union Jacks to everybody to wave, and we became known as the Jackians from then on. That's where that name came from. Yep, that's it, Union Jacks. There's more of them there, look. This was on the day of a royal visit. I think this was one of the viceroys arriving, because he always had his guards of honour lined up here in College Green, and you can see King Billy's statue there as well. But there are a huge amount of photographs in connection with these royal visits. Speaking of which, now this is the Royal Yacht Victoria and Albert in Kingstown Harbour for the 1900 visit of Queen Victoria. It was her last visit before she died the year later. And they always came into Kingstown. They never came into Dublin port. I think they felt that they were with their own out there. You know? And they didn't have to rub shoulders with the high polite when they came into Dublin port with driving up the docks or whatever, you know. But they really did themselves well, didn't they? I mean, the quality of that. And there she is there. That's just on the quay wall at Kingstown, ready to take off. You can see how tiny she looks there. It was said at the time she was as broad as she was tall. You know, another verse in that old song, the Queen, she came to call on us, she wanted to see all of us. I'm glad she didn't fall on us, she's 18 stone. But she had a penchant for these big burly Scotsmen wearing kilts. And a lot of you might have seen the great film with Billy Connolly as John Brown. Marvellous film. He was her paramour. I was hoping that one of these might have been John Brown, but apparently Brown had died long before this photograph was taken. She probably wore them out. But the two ladies with her are her two daughters. One was Princess Beatrice von Schleswig-Holstein. The other was Princess Helena von Battenberg. They were thick as thieves with the Germans at the time. They were all married to German princes and what have you. This was I actually think this photograph is back to front. It needs to be swung 180 degrees because the writing's back to front on that. I only noticed today. But they erected several of these over the years for various royal visits. And it was always on Leeson Street Bridge, because I think that defines the city limit or in some way. that the Lord Mayor would be waiting inside that to welcome the monarch, or whosoever it was, of the royalty that was coming in. And there was another one built down for Edward the Seventh, and he arrived of a different shape. And he used to take them down and erect them in other places. Now I can't remember exactly where that one was re-erected. But we mentioned King Billy earlier on. It was a very, very fine equestrian statue by the great sculptor Grinling Gibbons, who was also a wonderful wood carver. There are examples of his wood carving in Dublin Castle. But it was always a very contentious piece of sculpture, because during the 12th of July celebrations, the Orange people used to put green shamrocks and green emblems underneath the horses' hooves. And during nationalist celebrations and at other times, the statue used to get daubed with all sorts of nasty stuff, and they used to, it was blown up a few times at any rate. And ultimately, I think it was finally blown up around 1928. And I think it's been refurbished and it's in some English city now. But as I say, it was always a very contentious William of Orange, contentious statue. That's the Gough statue, another equestrian statue that went the same way, the way of all equestrian statues in the country. This one was by John Henry Foley, the man who sculpted the O'Connell monument, or statue. And that was blown up several times, had the head cut off it. And then it was finally blown up in the 1950s. I think that's in...
It wasn't the 1960s, was it?
It could well be now. I remember it vividly because I remember seeing it lying in a heap on the road. And it was taken away, and I think it's in, not Cheltenham, I named it something like that, anyway, it is still in existence. And the Wellington testimonial here, somebody tried to blow that up also in the 1950s, in the IRA campaign of the 1950s. And they brought a load of explosives up the tunnel. There's a railway tunnel that runs almost underneath it, that starts over at Island Bridge and comes out at Park 8th Street near the North Circular Road. And somebody went up there with a load of explosives and blew themselves up right at the top of the thing. You know? But I imagine you would have had to have a huge amount of stuff to take that thing down. It was a very fine statue. Gough was an Irish field marshal who was a contemporary of Wellington, but he lived to be a great age, and he fought in all of the various campaigns, what have you. And that was another one that was in Stephen's Green. This one is of George I by Van Nost, the sculptor. And I think it was originally on Essex Bridge, which is Capel Street Bridge now. It was at the side of the bridge, and the foundation of it was being undermined, and they moved it to Stephen's Green. It was directly opposite the Shelbourne Hotel. It was blown up also. I think that lasted until the 1940s, as far as I know. Now, I mentioned this, the building earlier on. This is taken in the grounds of the Priory. It's known as the Monk's Walk.
Yeah.
And it's part of the gardens. There's an awful lot more monks around them, and there are very few now. Nobody joins orders like that anymore. But there's a maritime connection in this. I don't know whether you're aware of it or not. Because when I blew it up and had a look at it, any of you ever read Hancock's History of Tallaght?
Yes.
It's an account of a whale, the carcass of a whale. There it is there, look. See the big whale bones?
Oh, yeah.
There's a man called Mr. Lentane bought a carcass of a whale down in Mayo, and he had it defleshed and had the bones moved down when it was a private house, and he had them erected on iron rods. You can see the holes for the iron rods and the bones. And it was there, whole and entire, erected in the garden in the 19th century. I went in to the Priory in the 1980s sometime, and I asked the prior, was there any of it left? And he directed me to an elderly gentleman who had been there from the early 1950s. And he said, no, there was a few bits of it left when he came as a young man, but at that stage, they all disappeared gradually, and there was none of it left. It was around the mid-80s that I went in. So that's the Tallaght whale. This has been in the news lately. The Hellfire Club, built by Speaker Connolly, has a weekend retreat. Drinking then, I suppose. I don't think he actually lived to enjoy it, as far as I know. I think he died either shortly before or shortly after it was completed. But it was built from two big stone cairns, burial mounds that were on top of the mountain here. And you can see the outline of them there. Excavated at the moment That's a picture taken by a drone. And they use all of the stones. You'll see these type of mounds up on other hills in the Dublin mountains, notably on Seafin and Seahan and places like that. Yeah. But there were burial chambers, but they're after making some very important discoveries now, because I think they've uncovered the remains of the burial chambers in them. And I think this may well have given rise to some of the superstitions and the stories of the devil appearing around the neighbourhood, that the superstitious country people didn't like these things being disturbed, and rightfully so, but for all the wrong reasons, I suppose. That's a picture of the back end of it. I think the roof was damaged on several occasions. I remember reading, again it may have been in Hancock, that they used to burn tar barrels up on the roof whenever these royalty would arrive, or whenever there was a coronation. That's very interesting, because there's only one part of that left. It's further down the mountain, and that bit is there. We knew it as children as McCarthy's Castle. It was also known as Carty's Castle. It's the Longhouse, Eli House, or Dollymount are all different names on it. It was built another of these hunting lodges by the Marquis of Ely, after Ely Place is named after him. It was just a hunting lodge, and there's a description in Hancock of how it gradually deteriorated by people simply taking bits away from it, walking off with bits of stone and timber out of the roof and everything else, and it gradually deteriorated. But it's certainly, that end of it is still standing. It looks like a medieval castle, tower house, that bit there. And there's all these round things that always intrigued me when I was a child. I think they were simply foundations from the floor to hold the floor up at a higher level. Aerial photograph, you see, there it is there, that's the tower. There was one of those towers at either end, and a whole lot of various outhouses. No, Tallaght. Old Bond Ridge. When I was a kid, that bit there was known as the tank. And it was 3 feet at that end and 6 feet at that end. It was a great place for a swim. Some of the more intrepid used to jump off the parapet into the deep end. I don't know whether it's still there or not, even whether it's been filled in. I know they certainly widened the bridge, but as far as I know, I think they kept the facades from either side of the stonework. I think it's still there, that they simply widened it. That's a picture of the far side of it. A lovely bridge, though, I must say. That's in Saggart, or it was. I don't know how much of that is there now. That was where Swift Brew Paper Mills was. That was the house originally attached to it. Now, I remember again, when I moved to Tallaght first in the 1970s, wandered all over the place looking at everything, and there was a lot of ruins up there. The paper mills were still going strong. I think it might well be still in existence, except that they don't make paper there anymore. I think the company might be still in existence. But at the time, it was a water-powered mill, and the river that comes down through the Slade, I think it's Cormac, is it? Powered the wheel, a massive big water wheel that turned on the machinery. And apparently it was on the go till quite recently. I was never in it when it was a paper mills, but there's quite a good few photographs. That's probably the tailing pond there for it. But my son tells me that there are quite a good few bits of the buildings remaining. Most of you would be familiar with this here. This and various other buildings that we're going to be looking at, it just amazes me how people, how can they allow things like that to degenerate and be knocked down? A beautiful house, built by Irish people, by Irish craftsmen, despite its association with the ascendancy back in the day. Nevertheless, it's part of the built heritage and they should have been preserved. Lord Massey's house up in Massey's estate. Apparently, you probably all have read If Those Trees Could Speak, a wonderful book that's been written about Massey's. I think there's going to be a lecture on the subject here sometime. Probably has been in the past. But the last Lord Massey apparently was a very dissolute and degenerate type of person who had mortgaged the place so heavily, he was massively in debt and could never redeem it. And he lived in the Gate Lodge, and he just allowed the place to degenerate and fall asunder. And after he left, the place simply went downhill and became derelict, and it's now demolished. But if you can go up there today, you can see the outline of the house and part of the beautiful gardens. The Massey family were into planting a lovely arboretum, a whole variety of trees of all various sorts. And thankfully, I think the whole thing's been taken over now and managed by Quilcha, as far as I know. It was in grave danger of being very, very badly damaged, I think, at one stage. Again, with this house here, this was probably one of the oldest houses standing in Dublin, Old Barn House. Now, I don't remember seeing it ever, and I'm not sure when it was knocked down. I think there may have been some that's still standing in the 1870s, 1970s, am I right?
No. Yeah.
Huh? Yeah, Old Barn House.
It's gone.
Go ahead.
They were-
Actually, about 1968, I remember walking up along Leyland, and there was the ruins of that house.
I've been told that.
About
because
68,
a couple of people that live in Tallaght told me that they saw it. I have no recollection of seeing it, and I thought I knew all of the antiquities around the place. Well, it was a fine big house. It was a 17th century house, and more's the pity now that it wasn't preserved in some way or another. I think the only bit of it that's left now, two bits of it left. I think there's a stone wall just before you turn up for Aylesbury. That was part of it.
It's fireplace.
You can see-
Fireplace is in the
Yeah, and the fire, coming to the fireplace now. Yeah. But there's some wonderful features on it. That's a fireplace. It's actually made from, it's plasterwork, stucco of some sort. And it's I've seen it many times in Kildare Street. I don't know whether it's still there or not, or up in Collins Barracks. But it's the fireplace from Old Barn House, and I think it depicts the building of the Tower of Babel or something like that from the Bible. Not sure exactly what it depicts. I climbed up to the top of this many times when I was a child, because this was what we knew as Timmins Castle, or Timon Castle as some people called it. We always called it Timmins Castle. I travelled the world as a young man back in the 1960s, and I remember once when I came home, going for a walk up here to have a look at it, and lo and behold, it was gone, demolished. I just couldn't believe it. It was eminently restorable, even though there was a big crack down it, and how they could just come along and whack it down in one go, it's just beyond me, with no reference to archaeological exploration or anything like that at all about it. Dreadful shame to see things like that going, I think. Thankfully that one is with us still. I say thankfully reservedly because I went to school there. That's Drumina Castle, and I don't have happy memories of going to school in the place, believe me. It was a bit like going to school in Auschwitz or somewhere. But the building's magnificent, and it was part of the school when I was there, although I didn't sit in there. I was in the new school. There were still classrooms in it, but it had been continually occupied since the time it was built, until such time as the Christian Brothers took it over as a school. And it's the only one that still has a moat around it, and it's been well restored by Peter Pearson and other people. And there's a visitor centre, and you can visit there now. Very fine one. It's a wonder they didn't knock down the round towers and all, except they had to do with Holy Catholic Ireland and nothing to do with the ascendancy, so that's probably why they left those standing, you know, knock everything else down. But when you look at that, it has hardly changed at all. As you're driving down there now, the road's probably a little bit wider, but it still looks exactly the same. You can see the chimney from, that's the Clondalkin paper mills in the distance there. It's a typical monastic site because a lot of monastic sites were circular, and you can trace the circular road around that, what would have been the monastic site, and they were also always near running water. And that's Clondalkin village that you come around today. All of that now is modern shops and houses on either side. As you can see there, it was just a little country village. But look what's up in the corner. Can you see it there? You can't actually see. You can just barely make it out there. Up in the corner, there's a sign up there, and that's what it is. There's a public telephone, one of the first public telephones systems, the Bell Telephone Company. You could go in there and make a call. Very early on. That's Saggart when it was a little country village also, just up the road. And I understand that there's a plaque. In fact, I remember reading it when I was at a wedding or a baptism in there. There's a plaque in there that says that the church was built by the man that owned the Swiftbrook paper mills. It's just been refurbished recently. But that's Tallaght, very recognisable. I know some of those buildings still there. Most of them have gone now in the new buildings, but it's still very recognisable as Tallaght Village. Does anybody ever remember the forge that was just there?
Yeah.
Yes.
There was a forge there, and the blacksmith. I used to stand for hours looking at the blacksmith shoeing horses, just beside that building. That building is still there, but just in the little recess where I think there was a butcher's, was an open door with a forge in it. And that's it looking the other direction. But there's, that's the same, yeah, some of those houses are still there. That's the tracks are on the road here for the Blessington steam tram, which must have been a great boon to travellers in bygone days. I remember reading about a great storm in 1895 when all of the roads around Tallaght, beyond Tallaght village, were impassable due to being flooded, and a man was washed away in a flash flood, a man called Nicholson, that the Blessington steam tram couldn't run. But there's a photograph of it there, wasn't it very fine? Lovely little steam engine, and this is up at the embankment. You know the way the road used to twist around in a big S-bend at the embankment? And I think that house is now gone. There was a sort of a gorge there. And this is about one of the watering stations where they used to fill up with water near the embankment. There were three classes of fares on this, first, second and third. I suppose the third class were up in the elements there, and the first class were down in the Cushionners downstairs. Second class would have had wooden seats probably. Things like that that defined class back then. This is down at the Terranure end. It ran from Terranure up to Blessington and later to Pool of Fuca. I think their yard was just somewhere over here that they could pull into, somewhere around there as far as I know. And I'm given to understand that that house there, which is still there, which is at an oblique angle to the road, was actually a toll house. It was a toll bridge there. And it's a feature that defines toll houses and also a lot of houses on canals and on railways as well, because you can look both ways for traffic coming both ways. Probably very, very old building that. Fine picture of Pool of Fuca waterfall. Isn't that a magnificent bridge? Absolutely fantastic. The amount of work that went into building that. It was a feature of this type of photography back in the day that you couldn't actually photograph running water very well because it wouldn't stand still long enough. You had to actually stand still for about 3 seconds, and it always comes out sort of white like that. Any moving water. That's it coming around. It's probably up by Crooks Lake. It's a real one of those. We can almost hear the whistle going. Yeah, and there was another one over on the far side, the Lucan steam tram, but it hadn't a patch on ours. Wasn't as nice looking. The railways, as you know, the first railway came to Ireland, or was built in Ireland in 1834, the Dublin to Kingstown Railway. And it was a great success because around about us, just not too long before that, the great harbour had been built out there. So the town of Dunleary, as we know today, grew up around the harbour first of all, and the packet station, the mail boats, and the railway also. But even in the late 1850s, when this photograph was taken, there was still competition for the travellers, because this is the Dublin to Kingstown coach. It says so on the side of it there. And I'm just looking at again, you have a bit of class distinction, because if you paid a few bob extra, you could probably get inside. If not, you have to climb up on top in all sorts of weather, I suppose. But it must have been very awkward getting in and out of things with these tall hats on you. But there's something very interesting going on down near the Carlisle Bridge. Just have a look down here. I'll show you a blow up with that now. Have a look at that. There's a flock of sheep being herded through the street there. Look at that. Now, it's not too long ago that was a common sight in Dublin. You'd see herds of cattle, herds of sheep being herded through the streets on market days from the cattle market and being herded down to the docks to be exported and what have you. But that's just a typical example, and I find this very amusing that the driver is just walking along nonchalantly and so are the cattle, and a couple of kids bringing up the rear, probably shunting them on, and the tram driver there is probably doing his nut. He won't get out of the way. But again, as I say, that would have been up near the cattle market on the North Circular Road. There was also competition from a steamship line that ran between Kingstown and Dublin. This is part of a stereographic view from about 1859, 1860. There was a small steamship line ran between Kingstown and the Customs House Quay for a few years. It wasn't very successful because the railways were simply just encroaching all the time and taking more and more passengers. Although in its day, there were about 6 vessels on the run, I think over a period of about 3 or 4 years, and then it just petered out. A lot of advertisements in the paper. The fare was sixpence. But they did have a lot of trouble with engines. As far as I know, that one was built in the place that is now the Liffey Dockyard, and it's the Anna Liffey. If you blow it up more, you can actually see the name on the bow. There were a lot of other types of steamships that were day trippers, went for trips around the bay. Now there's one of them goes around the bay today, motor ship. I think it's called the St. Bridget, and it's a fabulous trip around. You can go out around Lowth, down as far as Bray. But this was one called the Erin's King. Now there were a lot of them over the years. I just selected about 4 or 5. The Erin's King went from Customs House Quay from about 1890, overlapped up to about 1910, over a period of 20 years. Some of them were before that and some of them slightly after that. That was its own little tugboat that was used for turning it at the quay. But the fare on that for a run out into the bay, down as far as Dalkey and back, was a shilling. And I think on Saturdays or Sundays then they used to run an excursion out around Lamb Bay and down as far as Bray, up Dalkey Sound and back, 2 shillings. A meal thrown in and a brass band always. Wonderful to read the ads associated with them. That was another one there, the Duke of Abercorn. Now you can actually date that because you look at the lighthouse here on the end of the battery at Kingstown, as it still was then. It's been raised up. If you look at earlier photographs, it's about 2 metres lower. The light is nearly level with the wall. And mariners made so many complaints that they couldn't see the light. It was being obscured by the wall. So they raised it up about 1896. So that kind of conclusively dates that for you. That's one called the Aubrey. Again, left from Custom House Quay out around the bay. And that one there is the most interesting one. This is an earlier one called the Mars. Because this belongs to the 1860s. And it used to go out around the bay for trips out around Lamb Bay, down to Bray, Kingstown. But it also went on trips from Kingstown to Wicklow, either as day trippers or carrying passengers. And it went off during the American Civil War and became a blockade runner. And as far as I know, it was captured, running stuff for the Confederacy. It did a couple of successful blockade runs until the Union Navy captured it in the Gulf of Mexico somewhere. I think it was subsumed into the Union Navy then and was used by them. And as far as I know, I'm open to contradiction on this. I think it resumed as a ferry somewhere in New York after the American Civil War. Just a shot of the railway line, a very early shot of the railway line along by Black Rock. This little complex here is called Vance's Harbour. I'm jumping from one thing to another, but essentially there's a bit of transport in most of what I'm showing you. Because I have to tell you, ladies and gentlemen, that I have thousands of images and I just had to select a few for tonight, you know. So that little harbour is still there. You'll see it as you're going by on the Lewis. But there's a story about it, because there's 2 bridges, that one and the one that this photograph was taken off. Part of the deal that was worked out by the 2 people who owned that bit of land to allow the railway to run across it was that the railway company provided them with their own personal railway station, and that's it there. This was Harcourt Leas who ran the post office, and the man in this one was Lord Cloncurry, who lived in Morettimo House, which is just here, which is now gone. Black Rock House is still there. But this was a beautiful little complex, a little Doric temple there, cut granite was their bathing house, and there was a swimming pool here that they could put a gate across and keep the water in it. And I took photographs of that whole complex back in the early 1990s, and it was all still nearly intact, but it's all completely destroyed now. I've never seen a place so vandalised in all my life. You'd be ankle deep in syringes. I didn't think there were so many junkies in Black Rock, really. There must have been gallons and gallons of paint expended in graffiti and bottles and cans up to your knees. It's absolutely shocking. It was a lovely little complex at one time. As I say, the little private railway station is now gone. But it's a hard place to get to, because you have to actually get down onto the seashore and walk across a very rocky bit of ground. There's private access to it from up here with the residents, but I wouldn't say many of them go down there somehow. That's a picture of the railway at Dalkey from one of the stereographic views, probably around 1860. Because at that stage, Sorrento Terrace here had been built. There's an interesting feature on the Martello Tower and the battery over there. It's also interesting that they had these type of sleepers and tie bars They had a lot of problems early on with the railway. They had it laid on granite blocks, then they had it laid on gravel, until they ultimately settled on wooden sleepers. But this was from before that, and as you can see, it's only a single line. But that photograph there was probably taken on the same day. And as you can see, the Martello Tower, the guns are still on the Martello Tower. And you can see one of the 36-pounders on the battery at the south end of the island. Plus the fact that the roof over the magazine is still intact. Again, that has been very, very badly vandalised, that battery down there. Pieces thrown down off it, needlessly. And just a story about that, I'll just show you the tower there. That's a blow up of the tower with the guns still on it. They were on sliding, revolving carriages that went around and had a commanding arc of fire from any direction. And all the arcs of fire of these batteries overlapped the towers and the batteries. During the Crimean War, the French could see how strong they were militarily, and it was a great age of colonialism. The world was literally up for grabs in a colonial sense, and the French decided they wanted their share. So there was a massive rearmament program, and the British feared that it might be around too with the Napoleonic Wars, because there was a huge arms race ensued when all the great big warships started to be built, like HMS Warrior, and the French built La Gloire that started the whole thing off. So all of the Martello Towers at that time were rearmed, or remanned I should say. They had been abandoned before that, and some of them remained manned up till the 1880s. Back to trams again. Cartload of coal crossing behind the tram, as he's going that way. But have you look at these symbols up here. The symbols were put there for each different destination. There was a different symbol. And somebody succinctly explained why they were there, for the benefit of the illiterate, people who couldn't read. So that's another tram there, and you can see there were round balls on the previous one. That's Strand Road, and that's the Sandymount tram has these crescent-shaped symbols on it. I'll have to do a part 2 of this, or even a part 3 of this talk, and I'll tell you about that structure there, as you can see in the distance on Sandymount. That's Sandymount Baths. But there was a great big pier, something like a miniature Brighton pier, with all kinds of amusements, and a bandstand and everything else on it, and dressing rooms on it, in the 19th century, up to the 1920s in fact. But I found out what this person here did. They were simply a crowd that went around collecting empty bottles. There was money in empty bottles back then. Amazing how you can make a living out of that. And that's what we used to call a go-car. We call them buggies now. But anyway, there's the symbols there. That's the one we're looking at there with the crescent. And the one with the round ball on it, Nelson's Pillar to Palmerstown Park. A photograph of Trinity College with the military guard on the Bank of Ireland, which apparently persisted right up to the latter days of the British. There was always a military guard on the bank. And Christchurch Cathedral, before it was restored, when there's no steeple on it, as far as I know, it was restored by one of the great whisky companies in Dublin. It might have been Rose Distillery, I'm not sure. But they completely restored the cathedral as St. Patrick's was restored by Guinness's. And there's a photograph of the back of it. And I think it gives you an indication of the sort of higgledy-piggledy way in which houses and things grew up down Fishamble Street. But they're all different shapes and sizes. And look at the width of that house there. It's only one room wide, and a shop underneath it. Now you'd hardly recognise the back of the cathedral today from that. But this is just literally across the road from the cathedral. This is coming down Nicholas Street and into Patrick Street. Now all of that area there was bought up by Guinness's. The cathedral there in the distance was refurbished by Guinness's. And the whole area there was bought up, knocked down and cleared, because it was literally like just a warren of very unhygienic houses, a slum, for want of a better way of putting it. And they built those marvellous big red brick apartments that are still there today, called the Ivy Trust. I don't know exactly what's going on here. There's some kind of roadworks going on in the street. But there's a whole series of these I'm going to show you now, coming down Patrick Street. There's a lot going on there. If you look at that, that's looking up towards St. Patrick's as you come down the street. And that's the corner of Patrick's Close. A whole lot a whole lot of bills, as you used to call them, posters posted up there. If we had time, we'd read them all. But there's two donkeys and carts here in the foreground, and I'll just show you those. It's been the town that jumper is holding a duck. But if you just have a look at this thing up on the wall here, you might take a hazard a guess at what that is. Because it's number 29 Patrick Street.
Shape, is it?
No, it's not. I thought it was a figurehead. That was a tobacconist. I looked it up in the Tom's directories, and what that actually is a cigar store Indian of the type that the American tobacco companies used to make and give out to customers. I can't remember, now it's gone out of my head, the name of the tobacconist. Well, the tobacconist it was, and if you just have a look at it there, you can see where the stand is still on it, where it would have stood on the ground, and it's just been put up there as a sign. And I'd love to know, does it still survive? Probably not. There's a lot going on, as I say, in the street. There are various descriptions of Patrick Street back in the day. One by Charles Dickens, and it's utterly appalling to read what he wrote. And another by an American journalist that I found when he climbed up to the tower and described what he saw down below, the squalor. Apparently one side of the road was really obvious, fish and vegetables sold, and the other side was mostly confined to selling second-hand clothing that you can see here. You just have a look at this pub here. It's very interesting because that says John McCall, a lady selling fish here. The barrels outside. Now John McCall was a famous character. He was a county councillor. He was a folklorist, a songwriter and a poet. But his son was more famous. His son was P.J. McCall, who took over the pub from him. Now, P.J. McCall was a famous songwriter who wrote Bull of Vogue, Follow Me Up to Carlow, a whole lot of songs like that. Kelly the Boy from Killaan. He was also a corporation councillor, and James Connolly stood against him in 1902, and he rallied the forces of the church against Connolly, all of the sodalities and all, and he described Connolly as a godless communist, and he beat Connolly by a ratio of about 5 to 1. Some ladies there selling fish. Shawty women. You frequently see these ghost images in some of these glass plate photographs, because if anything moved while the photograph has been taken, it comes out as a sort of a blur. Now, this is very interesting. There's hens pecking in the street here. So there's still there, one up there. And I'm given to understand that that cart is what was known as a night soil cart. Apparently, if you weren't connected to the sewer that went into the puddle there, you could leave your stuff out, your night soil, in a box mixed with the ashes that you did the cooking on. It would be collected by these carts. It was brought up to a field in Dolphin's Barn that's still there. It's a playing field now that runs from the barn over to Clogger Road, and was stored there. It was owned by the corporation. And apparently the smell of it, we smelled for miles around. And farmers from County Dublin would then come along and take away cartloads at a very cheap price and spread it on the land as manure. That's why you see a lot of the detritus of everyday life, like bits of broken crockery and bits of pipes and oyster shells and stuff like that in the soil around South County Dublin. I do believe that there is a policeman keeping a watching brief there, Ken, a DMP man keeping an eye on, probably from Kevin Street around the corner, keeping an eye on things there.
That type of truck or a horse cart, that was used in the 40s for collecting the bins, certainly around.
Yeah, probably out of the same stable, literally. That's just a picture of Patrick's Close, one end of which we saw there with the hoardings on it. But you can see that's they be all gone. There's not a single example of that left in Dublin now. These were buildings with a strong Huguenot influence, with a gable front on them, like that. They're known as Dutch Billies, and quite a lot of study has been done on those. Mostly three-storey, of mostly Huguenot influence. And I'm going to show you a load of photographs now of I suppose the senior side of Dublin. Nobody even bothered to put the addresses on the back of these or on them at anywhere, because they didn't probably seem important enough. a lot of slum dwellings. As far as I know, I think most of them were taken at the behest of Dr. Cameron, who was the city health officer, who was appalled at the conditions in which the poor lived and at the outbreaks of disease that there was among children and adults. You had scarlatina, scarlet fever, diphtheria. He campaigned vigorously to have public housing built, both by the Dublin Corporation and by the artisans' dwellings. And as far as I know, this series of photographs here are in connection with that, but they have a few things in common. You'll generally see one tap in the middle of them. Now, these were mostly courts. These weren't the sort of tenements that were in big houses. Now, God knows there was enough of those in places like Summerhill and around what is now Sean McDermott Street, but these were places that were tucked in at the back of bigger housing estates, and an awful lot of them were purpose-built in their day to exploit the poor. They were built by people who were wealthy and lived in big houses and simply wanted to get as much money as they could out of these small dwellings. They were mostly known as courts. As I say, I don't know where they are, but the one thing that's common in them all is that most of the kids are going around on their bare feet in them. There's a fairly decent looking slating job has been done on that one, I'd have to say. But there you can see, now these boxes, it may well possibly be that these were for that soil I was telling you about. You can see no other useful function for them, and the one pump in the middle. A great many of them have a sort of an open sewer down the middle of them. It's pretty appalling looking. That's slightly cut down. The roof on that is, I wonder, it must have been leaking like a sieve. That'd be fairly typical now of the courts that were purpose built, because they were built back to back. There would have been another house on the far side of that, with another lane and another on the far side of that. And there were literally only little 2-room cottages. And a lot of them had this feature of this central drain going into God knows where, maybe a cesspit or maybe into a sewer, which were few in number. Another one there. And you'll see that there's a pump up that end and a gas lamp. You'll frequently see a gas lamp in them also. As I say, I'd love to know where they were.
There's a good few around Francis Street now.
Oh, absolutely. They were all over the city, Christie. They were everywhere. I think that building is still, I think that's down there off Cork Street, near what is used to be Brown Street and Chamber Street. But look at the houses, how small they are, and the state of the roads. Now, not all of the roads were actually cobbled with cobblestone. Some of them were just compacted gravel and would turn into mush, a mixture of mush and horse dung when it rained, and they were churned up by carts. Now these are fairly substantial looking houses here, yet you have this awful squalid looking place tucked in behind. You know, now these are the other type of tenements I was telling you about. These were originally very high status houses in Georgian times in Summerhill. And this was a sort of a warren of coach houses and stables and houses for the various retainers that would have been involved with them, like, you know, people who looked after horses, and all of those were occupied as well. But you'll frequently hear reference being made in these type of tenements up here as a 2-pair front and a 2-pair back. I think that simply meant a room that had 2 windows on it. You would have had several families perhaps living in the one room in a lot of these. Again, a lot of barefoot children here. You know? That looks familiar now, I just cannot put a finger on. But again, you have, look at one of these gable-fronted houses. So I imagine it's probably somewhere around the Liberties.
Looks like Marvin Lane.
I don't think it's quite Marylebone Lane, but you're heading down towards the Liberties, I would imagine. So that gable-fronted house was a feature of that area, because that's where a lot of the Huguenots settled. These have 2 things running down the middle of the street. They probably the ruts from cart wheels going up and down. God knows how long. Bare feet. A few children doing a bit of washing with a washing board. And I think that's a more modern picture. I think that's probably around Cuff Street in the 1950s. At least all the children have shoes on them there, but it's still pretty squalid looking. That's unbelievable what people were walking around in their bare feet there. And that's absolutely horrific. And a child there with his foot bandaged up, probably after getting an infection in his foot by virtue of having no shoes on him. When I was a kid, there was a thing called the Herald Boot Fund. Now, I've never actually seen anyone in their bare feet when I was young, but nevertheless I know it to have existed. that the Herald had a boot fund for buying shoes as one councillor fused for footless children. Some famous ignoramus of a corporation councillor. Children, well, at least they're clothed, but their clothes look perhaps as if they're in need of a wash, like themselves. A lot of barefoot children there. That's, again, in Dr. Cameron's thing, his reports that he said there were accompanying photographs of a lot of tenement houses. This was one of them there, and I'm almost sure that's where it came from. I'm just going to show you two more photographs now. Just see if there's anyone know who the people are. Because we're on the last two slides now. Well, three actually. I'll show you a third one. Does anybody know who that is?
Yeah.
You know. Anybody? No, he was a singer.
Joseph Lowth.
No, Dermot Troy. The reason I said because he lived right across the road from my wife Barbara. He tragically died in 1944. Or sorry, not in 1934. In the 60s, but he was only 34 when he died. And most beautiful, I actually heard him singing in Cashel Road. And who's this? On the bottom right hand side of this picture, who's it? Mixer Reid. Yeah, that's apparently the staff of the Royal Jimmy Campbell, yeah, and the bouncer that used to be on the door. I'll just finish off with this one here because I only rediscovered this. We spoke about this before, Malachy Horton's grave. I only found the photographs yesterday of his grave up in Saggart Graveyard, over against the wall. On the left hand side as you go in, and those are photographs from his book. So as I said, we'll have to have a part two or maybe a part three. Thank you very much.
Just before you go anywhere at all, just draw your attention to, you see there we have our banner here designed, and you see it featured in the slideshow just presented to us. Anybody, any questions in relation to any of the photographs seen there tonight?
Full Bridge, is that still there?
Oh yeah, that's fine with that. Now, the dam has been built just above it.
Right.
It was a very fine waterfall or cataract, whatever, before they built the dam. I actually have a couple of photographs of the dam I should have stuck being built. But there's literally only a trickle of water coming down through it nowadays from the dam, overspill on the dam. But myself and a friend walked all up through it years ago when we moved up here first, and we found a section of small railway track. We were wondering, was it from the Dublin to Blessington steam tram, or was it a little railway that they perhaps used when they were building the dam? But it was thrown down into the gorge anyway, and it was all built. We should have got a hacksaw and cut a piece off.
The Constitution you know that building?
Yeah.
Can you, what's the history of that, or what? Was it built purposely?
Oh, it was purpose built, yeah. Before the repeal movement bought up the adjoining properties to the Corn Exchange, the frontage of which is still there. And they used to hold their meetings, the repeal meetings, in the Corn Exchange building. But it wasn't always suitable because there was other meetings going on there. So they had quite a considerable income coming in from O'Connell's rent, as they called it, the repeal rent. They had quite a good turnover, so they bought the adjoining buildings and built it from the ground up as Conciliation Hall. And it was knocked down. It was still there, substantively had been added on to when the Irish press offices were there. And then it was ultimately knocked down to make way for the modern Irish press office, and subsequently a big office block there or something like that. Now, no traces now left as far as I know.
You haven't got any more of the court ones, have you?
Sorry?
Have you many more of the court?
Well, there are a good few more. I just took
where would I kind of find them?
a good few of them. Well, I've been gathering them up from all sorts of places, you know. Some friends of mine in the Royal Society of Antiquaries of Ireland gave me some of them.
Oh, did they?
Yeah. And like you can use them for this purpose here, but you wouldn't be able to publish them, you know, because they'd be copyrighted to whoever owns them. You know, and the same with the National Library stuff.
No, it's just where St. Patrick's Park is now. That used to be a
slaughterhouse
and a court.
You see the place where that tobacconist sign was?
Yeah.
That's exactly where Patrick's Park is now.
Really?
Yeah.
There was
But that was
slaughter.
all just level.
There
But
was,
in behind those buildings, you would have had all kinds of courts.
there was
I mean, yes.
slaughterhouses
Oh,
there.
everything. Yeah, up back lanes was not too long ago.
That's why
In Francis Street, you had them. Sorry. Oh, yeah.
Are you finished answering the lady?
Oh yeah, sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
When did the Irish newspaper start to be used for photographs? Or is that another
Yeah,
story?
no, I tell you, I've been looking at photographs, I've been looking at newspapers for a hell of a long time. Around about 1900, I think, was the first time I ever saw photographs. In 1895, there was, and it was a big thing because there was a little newspaper called Illustrograph came out, and it was like a smaller version of the Illustrated London News, and their sort of big selling point was that they had photographs in it. You know, because you didn't have, only very, very odd time you'd get. They kind of crept in under the door from about that time onwards. From about, you know, by 1910 now, 1905, 1910, there's still lots of them. I'd say, just at a guess now, I'd say the first of them would have been around 1900. There you go.
Is Malky Horton's house still there?
I've never been able to find where it is.
Yeah, there's just the north wall of the house and the dairy building.
Yeah, is it really? No,
That's what's happening.
I first heard about Malachy Horton. My father's foreman knew him because his wife was related to him in some way, and she was from up around Jobstown. And he told me that he often met Malachy when he was up courting the wife, and he was telling me about him when I was a young lad, you know. And he told me about this book, Malachy Horton Remembers. So back in about the 1960s, I got a copy of it. I paid 5 guineas for it, £5, 5 shillings, in. Remember the bookshop used to be in Nassau Street? Hannah's of one of those.
Greens.
No, it wasn't the one. It was the one before Greens, and I still have it. And it's a first edition. But I just happened to be talking to somebody from publishers one day down in Cork, who subsequently brought out, and I told them about the book Malachy Horton Remember. They were very interested, and a couple of months later they brought it out in paperback. But first editions of it are still fairly uncommon. But as I said, by the time I moved up to Tallaght, I was familiar with the story of Malachy Horton, and I went up Jobstown Lane looking to see could I find it. I could never spot it.
It's right up the top.
Is it at the very top? Yeah.
The very top.
Yeah. Apparently, Joe Porter, the man who was my father's foreman, told me that Malachy wasn't averse to selling a few whoppers, you know, and apparently he told Dr. George Little, who wrote the book, a few things that he knew he wanted to hear, you know, and that he was being plied with strong drink down in the Jobstown End quite a bit, you know. And George Little, from what I've heard from people who knew him in the old Dublin Society, told me that he never let anything as trivial as the facts get in the way of a good story. Sorry?
Just when were those old little cottages, when were they built roughly?
When were they built?
Yeah.
It would have been probably built from Georgian times onwards.
Oh, right.
You know, it would have been sort of concurrent with most of the buildings that were there. A lot of them might perhaps have been built as outhouses and stuff like that, but it is a fact, particularly in the newer places that sprung up, places like Kingstown, that an awful lot of the houses, the small courts and things out there grew up because there were just hovels that the workers on the harbour and on the railway were living in, and they became dwellings almost by osmosis. But again, a lot of them were actually thrown up by the people who owned the house out the front, and they were always built in such a way that you couldn't see them from the road, you know. But it was just a source of income for them, and the conditions in them were utterly appalling. The major outbreaks of cholera in Kingstown, for instance, and I'm sure there must have been several outbreaks of disease of one sort or another.
The photograph of the Lawrence photograph, that's fantastic. I didn't realise that they had a premises, or, you know.
Oh yeah, and it was, they literally, Lawrence himself wasn't a photographer, he was just a businessman. And amazingly, I think there's only one photograph of Lawrence himself in existence. You know?
I think the main source of the plates that survived is in Rathmines.
Yeah, they were in Rathmines and were in danger of being
shop.
Disposed of or thrown out or something, and somebody realised what was there, and I think bought them for the National Library, or the National Library bought them, I'm not sure which came.
Yeah.
You know? It's great that they did survive anyway, but I think probably as many were damaged and thrown out and destroyed, particularly during the 1916, because the place was gutted. It was part of one of the premises that was bombarded and went on fire.
Some of the text in Strumpet City, Jim Plunkett's play, reflects the sort of tenements and the tiny little court which you referred to earlier.
Absolutely. Plunkett knew, he had done his homework, he knew what had gone on in the city, and I think his book is a wonderful portrayal of life during all of that period, I must say. No doubt.
Lawrence's used to be where Anne Summershock was in.
Who?
Never heard of it.
On that spot there. It was substantial premises.
Yeah.
It was a 5, 6,
Yeah,
and 7 years
I
old.
think it took several addresses, as it were, you know, 5, 6 and 7 or whatever.
But thank you very much, Cormac. It was brilliant. We'll have to have a part there. Small little donation box at the back of the hall that just keeps us going, folks.
Check up.
All use our members, and as I said, that's the new banner now that we've prepared for the society.
Sorry, folks, if anyone wants to come up and have a look at this stereograph, this stereoscope here, you're more than welcome. We're probably tight for time, but you can have a quick look at
God
there.
bless, safe home,
There's
everybody.
a few views of Dublin in it there. Not as many as I'd like, but I want to get some more.